John Anderson was the kind of guy who liked things simple. He lived in a cozy suburban neighborhood where life moved at a steady pace, and drama rarely reared its head. His house wasn't anything fancy, just a two-story home with a small backyard. But it was his sanctuary. For years, John had enjoyed quiet evenings on his porch, sipping coffee while watching the sun dip below the horizon. But lately something felt off. It started with his electricity bill. One lazy Saturday morning, as he flipped through the mail, his eyes landed on the utility statement. The number at the bottom made him do a double take. His jaw dropped slightly. As he stared at the total, it was almost double what he usually paid. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. Maybe there was some glitch in the system or an error in billing. After all, nothing in his daily routine had changed. Or so he thought. Determined to get answers, John decided to investigate. Over the next few days, he went room by room, checking every appliance, light bulb, and outlet. He unplugged devices he didn't use often, swapped out old bulbs for energy-efficient ones, and even turned down the thermostat a notch. Yet despite his efforts, the meter kept spinning faster than ever. Something, or someone, was clearly using more power than they should. One evening, unable to shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss, John grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The cool breeze brushed against his face as he stepped into the backyard. It was dark, but the faint glow of the moon provided just enough light to see by. As he scanned the area, his gaze fell on the outdoor outlet mounted on the side of the house near the garden shed. There was nothing unusual about it, at least not at first glance. But then he noticed something strange. A long extension cord snaked along the ground, disappearing under the fence that separated his property from his neighbors. Curiosity piqued, John crouched down for a closer look. The cord was thick and weatherproof, designed to handle heavy loads. Following its path with his flashlight, he traced it back to his neighbor's yard. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Whoever owned that cord was tapping into his electricity supply without permission, and if they were doing it knowingly, that meant they were stealing from him. But as John stood there staring at the cord, another thought occurred to him. This particular outlet wasn't like the others in his house. In fact, it wasn't meant for casual use at all. Years ago, when the previous owners had built the house, they'd installed a sewage ejector pump in the basement. Because the lot sloped downward toward the street, the pump was necessary to move wastewater uphill and into the main sewer line. To ensure the pump always had power, the electrician had connected it to this very outlet. Without it, the entire system would fail, and fast. Suddenly, the situation took on a whole new level of seriousness. If whoever was using the outlet overloaded it, or worse, caused a power surge, it could spell disaster. Not only would it disrupt the pump's operation, but it could also lead to a catastrophic backup. Raw sewage flooding his basement. That was a nightmare John didn't want to imagine. Still, he couldn't help but wonder who was behind this. His mind immediately jumped to Margaret Karen Thompson, the woman who lived next door. Karen was infamous in the neighborhood for her over-the-top personality and obsessive attention to detail. She was the type of person who would call the HOA, Homeowners Association, over a single dandelion growing in someone's lawn. More recently, she'd become obsessed with decorating her house, not just for holidays, but year-round. Strings of twinkling lights adorned her roof, bushes, and even the mailbox, creating a dazzling spectacle that some found charming and others found excessive. Could Karen really be the culprit? John hesitated to jump to conclusions, but the pieces seemed to fit. Her extravagant display required a lot of electricity, and given her reputation for cutting corners, it wasn't hard to picture her sneaking an extension cord into his yard. Still, he needed proof before accusing anyone. So, with a mix of frustration and intrigue, John resolved to dig deeper. Little did he know, this discovery was only the beginning of a bizarre and unforgettable saga. Margaret Karen Thompson was the kind of neighbor who could either make your day or ruin it. She had lived next door to John for nearly 5 years, and in that time she had earned a reputation as the unofficial enforcer of the neighborhood's rules. Her sharp tongue and unrelenting focus on perfection made her both admired and feared by those around her. While some appreciated her efforts to keep the community looking its best, others found her constant nitpicking exhausting. Karen's latest obsession revolved around one thing: her holiday light display. It all started innocently enough. A few strands of twinkling lights here, a cheerful wreath there. But over time, her decorations grew more elaborate. By last Christmas, her house resembled something out of a winter wonderland fairy tale. Snowflake-shaped bulbs hung from the eaves, icicle lights dripped down the gutters, and an enormous inflatable snowman stood guard in the front yard. Even after the holidays ended, Karen refused to take them down. To her, the lights weren't just festive. They were a statement, a way to show everyone that she cared about making the neighborhood beautiful. But beauty came at a cost. As Karen added more lights, her electricity bill skyrocketed. At first she tried to ignore it, telling herself that the joy her display brought to others was worth every penny. However, when her monthly utility charges reached astronomical levels, reality set in. Something had to give. Karen wasn't the type to simply scale back, though. No, she needed a solution, and fast. That's when inspiration struck. Late one night, while pacing her living room and staring out at her glowing masterpiece, Karen noticed something unusual. Through the window, she spotted a faint orange glow coming from John's backyard. Curious, she crept outside to investigate. Peering over the fence that separated their properties, she saw it, the outdoor outlet mounted on the side of John's house. It looked ordinary enough, but to Karen, it represented opportunity. Her mind raced with possibilities. If she could somehow tap into that outlet, she could power her lights without racking up exorbitant bills. The idea was risky, sure, but Karen convinced herself it was harmless. After all, John barely used his backyard anymore, and the outlet seemed neglected. Surely he wouldn't miss a little extra electricity, right? Besides, what he didn't know couldn't hurt him. The very next evening, under the cover of darkness, Karen put her plan into action. Armed with a heavy-duty extension cord and a pair of gardening gloves, she quietly slipped into her backyard. Carefully, she fed the cord through a gap in the fence and plugged it into John's outlet. On her side, she connected it to a surge protector, which allowed her to distribute power to multiple strands of lights. When she flipped the switch, her entire display lit up like magic. For a moment, she stood back and marveled at her handiwork. Not only had she solved her financial problem, but she'd also managed to pull off the ultimate stealth operation. Over the following weeks, Karen fell into a routine. Each night, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, she would discreetly plug in her lights and bask in the glow of her brilliance, literally and figuratively. To her, this arrangement felt foolproof. John never mentioned anything, and no one else seemed to notice. Everything appeared to be going smoothly. What Karen failed to consider, however, was the bigger picture. She had no idea that the outlet she was using wasn't just any ordinary plug. Unbeknownst to her, it played a critical role in keeping John's sewage ejector pump running. Nor did she realize that tampering with such systems carried serious risks, not just for John, but potentially for herself as well. In her quest to maintain her dazzling display, Karen had unknowingly stepped onto thin ice. And sooner or later, cracks were bound to form. For now, though, she remained blissfully unaware. Every evening she admired her twinkling lights, confident in her cleverness. Meanwhile, across the fence, John continued to piece together the mystery of his skyrocketing electricity bill. Neither of them knew it yet, but their worlds were about to collide in ways neither could have anticipated. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Sure, he'd traced the mysterious extension cord back to Karen's yard, but that discovery only deepened the mystery. Why would she risk sneaking into his property to use an outlet? And more importantly, what exactly was she powering with it? The questions gnawed at him, keeping him up at night. He needed answers, and fast. Determined to get to the bottom of things, John began paying closer attention to his surroundings. Every evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, he noticed subtle changes in his house. For one, There was a faint humming sound coming from somewhere outside. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent. A low mechanical drone that seemed to pulse faintly in the background. At first, he dismissed it as part of the neighborhood's usual nighttime symphony. Crickets chirping, distant, cars passing by, or maybe even the hum of electricity coursing through nearby power lines. But the more he listened, the clearer it became that the noise wasn't natural. It was man-made. Then there were the flickering lights. On several occasions, John caught glimpses of his indoor lights dimming or brightening unexpectedly, especially during heavy rainstorms. At first, he chalked it up to old wiring or a temporary surge in the grid, but the timing felt too coincidental. Each time it happened, he realized the outdoor outlet behind his shed was likely involved. Something, or someone, was putting a strain on the system, and it wasn't designed to handle such demands. But perhaps the strangest clue came on humid nights. John started noticing an unpleasant smell wafting through the air, particularly near the backyard. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but over time it grew stronger. The odor was unmistakable. Sewage. His stomach turned just thinking about it. Could the two things, the strange smells and the overloaded outlet, be connected? If so, how? The pieces slowly began falling into place. John remembered what the previous owners had told him when he bought the house. The outdoor outlet was directly linked to the sewage ejector pump. This pump was essential for moving wastewater out of the basement and into the main sewer line. Without it, raw sewage could back up into the house within hours. Suddenly, the implications of Karen's unauthorized use of the outlet hit him like a ton of bricks. What if her constant draining of electricity was causing the pump to malfunction? The thought sent chills down his spine. Still, John knew he needed proof before confronting anyone. Accusing Karen outright without evidence would only escalate tensions, and knowing her personality, she'd probably deny everything and accuse him of harassment. So instead of jumping the gun, he decided to set up a hidden camera. A friend of his who worked in security lent him a small, weatherproof device that could record video day and night. That weekend, under the pretense of cleaning out his garden shed, John discreetly mounted the camera near the outlet. He positioned it carefully, ensuring it captured both the plug and anyone approaching it. For the next few days, John kept a close eye on the footage. At first, nothing unusual happened, but on the third night, just as the sky turned dark, he spotted movement on the screen. His heart raced as he watched Karen emerge from her side of the fence. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder as though checking for prying eyes. In her hands, she carried the thick extension cord he'd seen earlier. With practiced ease, she plugged it into his outlet and hurried back to her yard, disappearing into the shadows. John rewound the video and watched it again, his mind racing. There was no denying it now. Karen was using his electricity to power her extravagant light display. Worse still, she had no idea or didn't care that the outlet was tied to the sewage pump. If something went wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. Not only would John's home be at risk, but the entire neighborhood could suffer if the system failed. Despite the mounting frustration, John forced himself to stay calm. He knew acting impulsively wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he spent the next few days gathering more evidence, documenting every instance of Karen plugging in her cord. By the end of the week, he had enough material to prove his case beyond any doubt. But proving it was one thing. Deciding what to do next was another. John wrestled with his options. Should he march over to Karen's house and confront her directly? Or should he involve the HOA and let them handle the situation? Either way, he knew this wouldn't end quietly. Karen wasn't the type to admit fault easily, and her pride might make her lash out. Still, sitting back and doing nothing wasn't an option either. The stakes were too high. As he sat in his living room staring at the video footage on his laptop, John felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone be so reckless? More importantly, how could he make her understand the gravity of the situation without turning it into a full-blown feud? One thing was certain. Whatever happened next, it would change their relationship and possibly the entire neighborhood, Forever. John had seen enough. Armed with hours of video evidence and a growing sense of frustration, he knew it was time to confront Karen. He couldn't sit back any longer, not when the stakes were so high. Still, he approached the situation cautiously. After all, this wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about making her understand the potential dangers she'd created without realizing it. The next afternoon, John walked over to Karen's house, his laptop tucked under one arm. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also wanted to ensure she couldn't deny what he was about to show her. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on her front door. Moments later, Karen appeared, her usual air of confidence radiating as she opened the door wide. "Oh, hi, John," she said with a tight smile, though there was a hint of suspicion in her tone. "What brings you here?" "Hey, Karen," John replied, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I need to talk to you about something important. Do you have a minute?" Karen hesitated for a split second before nodding. "Sure, come on in." She led him into her living room, where the faint glow of fairy lights twinkled even in the middle of the day. John tried not to let the irony get to him as he set the laptop down on her coffee table. Turning it on, he pulled up the video footage from the hidden camera. Without saying a word, he clicked play and turned the screen toward Karen. For a few seconds, she watched silently, her brow furrowing as the video showed her sneaking into John's yard and plugging the extension cord into his outlet. When the clip ended, she looked up at him, her face a mixture of shock and defensiveness. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Are you spying on me now?" "No, Karen," John said firmly, maintaining his composure. "I'm not spying. I'm trying to figure out why my electricity bill has doubled and why my sewage pump might fail, because someone keeps using an outlet they shouldn't." Karen scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "You're accusing me of stealing your electricity? That's ridiculous. I would never do something like that." "It's not an accusation. It's fact," John countered, pointing to the screen. "That's you every night plugging into my outlet, and here's the thing. That outlet powers my sewage ejector pump. If something goes wrong because of this, raw sewage could flood my basement, and maybe even your yard, too." Karen rolled her eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Oh, please. You expect me to believe that tiny little outlet runs your entire plumbing system? Stop being dramatic, John." "I'm not being dramatic," John shot back, his patience starting to wear thin. "This isn't some random garden plug, it's critical infrastructure. The previous owners installed it specifically for the pump. If it gets overloaded or short circuits, we're both in trouble." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Well, if that's true, then why hasn't anything happened yet? Sounds like you're just looking for excuses to stir up drama. Maybe because I reported your overgrown lawn last month?" John clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to raise his voice. Of course she'd bring that up. To Karen, everything was personal, a tit-for-tat battle where she always played the victim. But he refused to let her deflect the issue. "This isn't about revenge or grudges," he said evenly. "It's about safety for both of us. Whether you believe me or not, you're putting yourself and everyone else at risk by using that outlet. All I'm asking is that you stop." Karen narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment it seemed like she might actually consider what he was saying. But then her stubborn streak kicked in. "You can't prove any of this," she snapped, standing up abruptly. "And even if you could, who says I did it on purpose? Maybe someone else is using my lights without my knowledge. Ever think of that?" John sighed, shaking his head. Arguing further wouldn't get him anywhere. Karen had already decided she was right, and no amount of logic or evidence would sway her. Still, he wasn't ready to give up entirely. "Fine," he said, closing the laptop and tucking it under his arm. "If you won't listen to reason, I'll have to involve the HOA. They should know what's going on, don't you think?" Karen's face flushed red, anger flashing in her eyes. "Go ahead and try," she spat. "But don't be surprised when they side with me. Everyone knows how petty you are." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving John standing alone in her living room. Frustrated but unsurprised, he let himself out and headed back home. As much as he hated to admit it, Karen's reaction confirmed. One thing, reasoning with her wasn't going to work. She was too John knew he had to act quickly. Karen's refusal to listen and her outright denial of the problem left him with no choice but to escalate things. But how could he make her understand the gravity of the situation without turning it into a full-blown neighborhood scandal? He needed a way to show her, not just tell her why tampering with the outlet was so dangerous. And for that, he decided to enlist some professional help. The next morning, John called a local plumber who specialized in sewage systems. When the plumber arrived, John explained the situation in detail. The unauthorized use of his backyard outlet, its connection to the sewage ejector pump, and Karen's stubborn insistence that nothing was wrong. The plumber listened intently, nodding as he pieced together the scenario. "This is serious," the plumber said after a pause. "If that pump fails, it won't just affect your house, it could back up into the main line and cause problems for the whole block. We need to demonstrate this to her in a way she can't ignore." Together, they came up with a plan. They would temporarily disable the sewage ejector pump and allow water to accumulate in the lines. This would simulate what might happen if the pump were overloaded or shut down due to an electrical issue. Then they'd wait until Karen plugged in her lights again, which would trigger the malfunction. It wasn't about causing harm. It was about creating a controlled environment where the consequences of her actions would become undeniable. That evening, as the sun began to set, John and the plumber put their plan into motion. First, they disconnected the pump and monitored the water levels in the basement. Slowly but surely, wastewater started pooling in the pipes, waiting for the moment when the system would fail completely. Meanwhile, Karen went about her usual routine, oblivious to what was happening on the other side of the fence. As darkness fell over the neighborhood, the familiar glow of Karen's holiday lights flickered to life. Strings of colorful bulbs lit up her roof, bushes, and mailbox, casting a festive shimmer across the yard. On any other night it might have been beautiful, but tonight it carried an ominous undertone. Unbeknownst to her, the extension cord, snaking through her fence, was now the final link in a chain reaction that was about to unfold. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The lights burned brightly and the hum of electricity filled the air. But then inside John's house, the faint gurgle of water turned into a louder, more insistent sound. Seconds later, the unmistakable smell of sewage wafted through the vents. John exchanged a glance with the plumber, who gave a solemn nod. It was happening. Within minutes, raw sewage began bubbling up through the drains in John's basement. Dirty water spilled onto the floor, spreading quickly across the concrete. At the same time, the backup pressure forced some of the waste to seep out into Karen's yard through shared infrastructure. A disgusting brown sludge oozed out near her flower beds, coating her once pristine landscaping in filth. It didn't take long for Karen to notice. Standing outside admiring her lights, she suddenly caught a whiff of the foul odor. Her nose wrinkled in disgust as she followed the smell to its source. What she saw made her gasp in horror. The ground around her prized garden was covered in sewage, and the stench was overwhelming. Frantic, she rushed back inside, only to find that her own drains were starting to back up too. Panic set in as Karen realized the magnitude of the disaster. She grabbed her phone and dialed John, her voice trembling with urgency. "John, something's wrong. My yard, my house, there's sewage everywhere. What's going on?" John answered calmly, though he couldn't suppress a small sense of vindication. "Karen, I think it's time we talked again. Remember that outlet you've been using? Well, it powers the sewage ejector pump. When the pump failed tonight, everything backed up, including into your property. I warned you this could happen." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I thought you were exaggerating." "I wish I had been," John replied. "But now you see exactly why this is such a big deal. You can't just plug into someone else's outlet without understanding what it does, or risking everyone's safety." Defeated and humiliated, Karen hung up the phone. For the first time, she seemed truly remorseful. As she stared at the mess in her yard, tears welled up in her eyes. The glittering lights that had once brought her pride now felt like a cruel joke. All her efforts to create beauty had led to destruction, and worse, she knew it was entirely her fault. Back at his house, John sighed as he surveyed the damage in his basement. Cleaning up wouldn't be easy, but at least Karen finally understood the stakes. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that stick, and as messy as things were right now, John hoped this experience would lead to a better, more respectful relationship between them moving forward. The plumber stayed late into the night, working tirelessly to restore the system and prevent further damage. By the time they finished, both John's basement and Karen's yard were cleaned up, at least enough to stop the immediate crisis. Exhausted but relieved, John thanked the plumber and headed to bed, knowing tomorrow would bring a fresh start. For Karen, however, the night was far from over. As she sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the lingering smell of sewage, she replayed the events in her mind. How could she have been so blind? So selfish? For years, she'd prided herself on being the perfect neighbor, the one who kept everything in order. Yet here she was, responsible for one of the biggest disasters the neighborhood had ever seen. Sleep eluded her as guilt gnawed at her conscience. She knew she owed John an apology, one that went beyond words. Tomorrow, she vowed, she would do whatever it took to make things right. Not because she wanted to save face, but because deep down she realized she'd crossed a line. And sometimes crossing that line is the only way to learn where it belongs. The morning after the sewage disaster dawned cold and gray, casting a somber mood over the neighborhood. John woke up feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. The immediate crisis had been contained, at least for now, but the cleanup process was far from over. His basement still smelled faintly of sewage, and he knew it would take days, if not weeks, to fully restore everything to normal. Still, there was a small sense of satisfaction in knowing that Karen had finally seen the consequences of her actions. As he sipped his coffee on the porch, John noticed movement next door. Karen emerged from her house looking unusually disheveled. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she wore an old sweatshirt smeared with dirt, a stark contrast to her usual polished appearance. In her hands, she carried a bucket filled with cleaning supplies. Without hesitation, she marched straight toward John's yard. When she reached the fence, she stopped and called out softly, "John, can we talk?" John set his mug down and stood up, surprised by her tone. Gone was the sharp edge in her voice. Instead, it was replaced with something softer, almost fragile. He walked over to meet her, unsure of what to expect. "Listen," Karen began, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I want to say I'm sorry for everything. Last night, seeing what happened in my yard in your basement, it made me realize how reckless I've been. I never meant to cause harm. I honestly thought that outlet was just unused. I didn't know about the pump or any of this." Her words came out haltingly, as though each one pained her to say. For a moment, John simply studied her face. The woman standing before him looked nothing like the self-assured, combative neighbor he'd come to know. This was someone humbled, someone who had spent the night grappling with guilt and regret. "I appreciate the apology," John said finally, choosing his words carefully. "But you have to understand why this is such a big deal. That outlet powers something critical, not just for me, but potentially for the whole neighborhood. If something goes wrong again, the results could be even worse." Karen nodded fervently. "I get it now. Really, I do. I was so focused on saving money and making my lights look perfect that I didn't stop to think about the bigger picture. I wasn't being considerate, not of you and not of anyone else." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I want to make things right. Starting today, I'll pay for the damages. Whatever it costs to clean up the mess, fix your pump, or repair anything else, I'll cover it. And I'll also let the HOA know what happened. Not to throw myself under the bus, but to make sure everyone understands how important these systems are." John raised an eyebrow, surprised by her offer. He hadn't expected her to take responsibility so completely. "That's generous of you," he admitted. "But more than paying for repairs, I hope this teaches you to think twice before doing something like this again. It's not just about rules or property lines, it's about respecting boundaries and considering the impact of your actions." "I hear you," Karen replied earnestly. "And trust me, I've learned my lesson. No more shortcuts. From now on, I'll handle things the right way, even if it means scaling back my decorations." With that, she extended her hand, a gesture of peace. After a brief hesitation, John shook it, sensing that this marked the beginning of a new chapter between them. Over the next few days, Karen kept her promises. She hired professional cleaners to sanitize both her yard and John's basement, ensuring every trace of the sewage backup was gone. She also arranged for an electrician to inspect the outdoor outlet and install a lockable cover. Months passed since the infamous sewage incident, and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The once tense atmosphere between John and Karen softened into something resembling harmony. While they weren't close friends, their interactions became warmer, marked by small gestures of kindness that hinted at a newfound respect for one another. It was as though the entire ordeal had acted like a reset button, not just for them but for the community as a whole. Karen's transformation was perhaps the most surprising. She traded her role as the self-appointed HOA enforcer for that of a supportive neighbor who genuinely cared about making the area better. Gone were the days of nitpicking over minor rule violations or filing complaints about trivial issues. Instead, she channeled her energy into organizing events that brought people together. One summer evening, she hosted a block party featuring homemade snacks, live music from a local band, and even a friendly competition for the best decorated front yard. To everyone's delight, including her own, she awarded first place to an elderly couple whose modest flower garden had always flown under the radar. Her holiday light display also underwent a dramatic change. No longer the dazzling spectacle that drained electricity and drew attention for all the wrong reasons. It now featured tasteful, understated designs powered entirely by solar panels. Karen proudly explained to anyone who asked how she'd switched to sustainable energy sources, emphasizing the importance of being mindful of resources. Some neighbors joked that she'd gone green with guilt, but most appreciated her efforts to set a positive example. John, too, noticed subtle shifts in his own perspective. Before the incident, he'd preferred to keep to himself, content with his quiet routines and occasional chats with neighbors. But after witnessing the ripple effect of Karen's actions, and later, her redemption, he realized the value of staying engaged with those around him. He began attending HOA meetings more regularly, offering constructive input rather than simply observing from the sidelines. When a young family moved in across the street, he surprised them with a welcome basket filled with baked goods and a handwritten note containing tips for navigating the quirks of suburban living. The neighborhood itself seemed to benefit from the changes. Conversations flowed more freely at weekend barbecues, and residents started looking out for one another in ways they hadn't before. A shared Google spreadsheet appeared online, where people could list skills they were willing to offer, like lawn care, plumbing, or pet sitting for free or at reduced rates. Even the annual spring cleanup day felt different this year, with record turnout and laughter echoing through the streets as volunteers worked side by side. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were still moments of disagreement, like when someone accidentally parked in the wrong driveway or left trash cans out too long. But these incidents no longer escalated into full-blown feuds. Instead, they were resolved with calm discussions and mutual understanding, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined the community. For Karen, the lessons learned extended far beyond avoiding unauthorized use of electrical outlets. She came to see herself not as the guardian of perfection, but as part of a larger ecosystem where cooperation mattered more than control. Late one evening, as she sat on her porch admiring the gentle glow of her solar-powered lights, she reflected on how much she'd grown. The memory of raw sewage bubbling up in her yard still made her cringe, but it also reminded her of the importance of humility and accountability. John, meanwhile, found himself reflecting on the irony of it all. What had begun as a frustrating mystery turned into a catalyst for growth, not just for Karen but for everyone involved. As he watered his garden one sunny afternoon, he chuckled to himself, thinking about how many dinner parties he'd regale with the tale of HOA Karen and her ill-fated extension cord. Yet beneath the humor lay a deeper appreciation for the resilience of human relationships. People make mistakes, he thought, but what truly matters is how they choose to move forward. In the end, the backyard outlet saga served as a reminder of two timeless truths. First, that every action has consequences, whether intended or not. And second, that even the most unlikely individuals can inspire meaningful change when given the chance. For John and Karen, it wasn't just about fixing a problem. It was about building bridges, fostering trust, and creating a community where everyone felt valued. And so, as the seasons changed and the neighborhood continued to thrive, both John and Karen carried forward the lessons they'd learned. They may have started as adversaries, but they ended up proving that sometimes the messiest situations can lead to the brightest outcomes. After all, life in the suburbs, like life anywhere, isn't about avoiding conflict altogether. It's about finding ways to grow stronger because of it.